Part 3 is return to school, and here's where we'll talk about that return to school process and different accommodations that can be put in place to support the learner who has sustained a concussion. In the immediate aftermath of a concussion, initially it's important for the student who's had a concussion to rest their brain and to get good sleep. Overall, the advice from physicians is to limit physical, emotional, or cognitive activities to a level that is tolerable to the student and that doesn't cause symptoms to flare or to re-emerge. But we know that it's not reasonable for a student to just be kept in a dark, quiet room for days on end, and it's not healthy. So we want students to engage in activity to a level that is tolerable. We look at exertion and rest as following along a continuum, and while we want them to progress toward full activity or no rest during the day to a level that is tolerable, to a level that doesn't cause their symptoms to reemerge or to flare. If a student sustained an injury to her leg, of course, the advice would be to stay off that leg and to rest it. So similarly, when a student has sustained an injury to the brain, we want to encourage that student to obtain cognitive rest. And this can be difficult because often the child looks and seems fine, but that brain needs time to heal. Often when students just stay home from school, they're playing video games, they're watching TV, they're listening to music on their headphones, and all of those are things that can cause symptoms to flare. So if a student is staying home to rest a concussion, that student needs to be told, and parents need to be told, that he or she should avoid extensive computer or tablet use, texting, or have it be very minimal, avoid video games, TV, music, especially loud music, and listening to music by headphones. And all of those activities can be gradually increased to a point that is tolerable and doesn't cause symptoms to flare. When the student engages in those activities, it causes the brain to work harder to process information and can not only flare symptoms, but also slow recovery. The student would also be advised to get physical rest, and that means no participation in physical activity until being cleared by a physician. And this includes physical education class, sports activities, practice, games, rigorous outdoor play. Physical activity after a concussion can magnify existing symptoms, and it can also put that child at risk for a second concussion. And that second concussion can potentially be more serious because the brain is already injured. The brain's already going through that process of recovery. So if you remember the symptoms of concussion, one of them involves a student feeling off kilter and being off balance. So if you have that off balance student engaging in physical play, they may be more apt to sustain an injury from engaging in physical activity. Here we have the stepwise return to academics progression, and there are more detailed descriptions of each of these steps in the manual that accompanies this presentation. So the first step is no school and total cognitive and physical rest. So in this phase of recovery, the student may have a high level of symptoms that prevent him or her from benefiting from being in school. And at this point, physical symptoms tend to be the most prominent and can interfere with even basic tasks. So the family should receive guidance from the healthcare professional regarding the student's readiness to return to school. And that decision would be based on the number, type, and severity of symptoms. And this first step for some students may only be a day, and they may soon be ready to move to step 2 of partial day attendance with adjustments. Some physicians may think that the student is recovering quickly enough that they could skip this partial day step entirely and move to a full day with adjustments. But the recommendation is to go to step 2. That would be a student who might attend school for a half day, or they may only attend for their core classes. Their symptoms have decreased to manageable levels, but at this point, symptoms may be exacerbated by certain mental activities that are complex, difficult, or have a long duration. So at this phase, we're really balancing rest with a gradual reintroduction to school, and the student's going to be encouraged to avoid tasks that produce, worsen, or increase symptoms. A good piece of advice is at this stage, there can be breaks folded into the school day, such as rest time in the nurse's office. At the third stage of the return to academic progression, the student would be back to school for a full day, but with adjustments. And those would be the adjustments that were identified on the academic adjustments form that are symptom-based. And at this phase, the student's overall symptoms have decreased both in number and severity. And they may, at this point, be exacerbated by certain activities, but there would be times when there would be cognitive activities or physical activities that are mild in nature that do not have a drastic effect on symptom levels. And by physical activities, we're still not talking at all about gym class or sports practice. Physical activities at this stage would be just walking throughout the school building, carrying a light load of books, and so forth. When the student can handle the full day with adjustments well and symptoms are resolving, they can move to step 4, which is the full day without adjustments. At this phase, the student may not have any symptoms or may have mild symptoms that are intermittent. At this point, adjustments are removed when the student can function fully without them. The student should still not be engaging in physical activity until released by a healthcare professional. And at that point, they can then move to step 5, which is a full day of school with full extracurricular involvement. Here we have a decision-making chart that can help educators determine participation of a student who's had a concussion to an extent that doesn't worsen symptoms. So the educator would look at gradually increasing cognitive demand and seeing what effect that has on symptoms. So if cognitive demands in the classroom in terms of doing homework, doing tests, participating in group projects and so forth are put into place and there's no change in symptoms, then the school team can continue gradually increasing cognitive demands to the point of full academics. However, if the increase in cognitive demands causes a flare of symptoms and symptoms increase or worsen, they're advised to discontinue the activity and allow the student to have complete cognitive rest for about 20 minutes. And that could occur down in the nurse's office, or it could even occur in a quiet place within the classroom. If at that point symptoms improve with that 20 minutes of rest, the student could restart the activity either at or below the same level that produced symptoms. So maybe there was a sheet of work that they were focusing on, they started to get a headache, the student rested, and when they restart working on that assignment, they may have permission to only do part of that sheet instead of continuing to do the full assignment. However, after that 20 minutes of rest, if the symptoms have not improved, then the educator is advised to discontinue the activity and to resume when the symptoms have lessened, such as later in the day or even the next day. It's advised that academic adjustments following concussion are front-loaded so that the student is provided ample adjustments to the classroom expectations and to the environment, and then those adjustments can be gradually withdrawn as the student recovers and as symptoms resolve. Some students might be reluctant to accept these adjustments and accommodations and instead try to push through their symptoms, and the motivation behind that may be that they just want to get through the work. They are stressed by the idea of homework piling up. That make them very anxious. So really strong piece of advice to teachers is to determine how the workload can be modified so that anxiety is not as significant. We're going to talk a little bit about how adjustments can be mapped onto symptoms so that if students have general symptoms or cognitive, physical symptoms or emotional symptoms, how you can best choose appropriate adjustments. And then teachers can determine how to modify the workload. There may be some assignments that can completely be excused, and that can be one of the greatest gifts that a teacher can give to a student with a concussion because of that stress and anxiety that can be associated with assignments building up and building up. So there may be some assignments that don't have to be made up, or there may also be some assignments for which the student is accountable but does not need to complete the full assignment. So in this point, we would say they would be responsible for the content, but not for the process. So other classmates may need to write a 5-page paper on a book that was read, and perhaps the student who sustained a concussion can instead give a verbal summary to the teacher. Then there may also be assignments that we would call responsible assignments that must be completed by the student and will be graded. So if a teacher is having difficulty figuring out how to modify the workload and which assignments should be excused, accountable, or responsible assignments, that would be another role of the concussion team leader or a designated concussion team member like the school psychologist or the school counselor who can help teachers figure out how much work is tolerable. Here are descriptions of some of the items that can be selected on the academic adjustments for concussions checklist that is part of the support documents of this training. The first is the adjusted class schedule. The student could attend alternate days, for example, going to school every other day, have a shortened school day, have shortened class periods, or start the day late so that the student can sleep as late as possible. That can be a good choice, particularly in schools that start very early in the morning. Another one is having no PE class until being cleared by a healthcare professional, no physical play at recess, and in those cases, it's helpful to have a plan in place for what the student is going to do instead. So perhaps a good friend could be chosen to do a quiet activity with the student during recess or something along those lines to make sure that there isn't an undue opportunity for emotional or anxiety stressors because the student is missing out on social opportunities. The student may be permitted to audit a class or to participate in a class without producing work or getting graded if it's important for them to still be exposed to the content, but if it's also known that the production of work might exacerbate symptoms or if the grades they would receive for produced work wouldn't accurately reflect their true potential had there not been a concussion. Another general adjustment is avoidance of noisy and overstimulating environments such as band class, loud noisy hallways, pep assemblies, things like that. Allowing students to drop high-level or elective classes without a penalty if adjustments go on for a long period of time. And this would be a situation that might call for a sit-down team meeting with administrators, other team members, and parents. Removing or limiting testing and or high stakes projects during the recovery period. Again, those could be postponed, modified, or eliminated altogether depending on what the work is. And allowing alternate periods of mental exertion with periods of mental rest throughout the day. Some adjustments that would be appropriate for students who have significant cognitive symptoms include reducing class assignments and homework to only those tasks that are deemed absolutely critical, exempting non-essential written classwork or homework because the act of writing, especially on a computer, can be taxing and cause cognitive symptoms to flare, and also to base grades on adjusted homework. So the student doesn't also have the stressor of having their grades affected by their injury, by their medical condition. The teacher can provide extended time to complete assignments and tests, provide adjusted due dates. Once a key learning objective has been presenting, reducing repetition to maximize cognitive stamina. So if the rest of the class is, for example, doing 30 math problems, perhaps the student who still has concussion symptoms can only do 5 problems so they can demonstrate their knowledge with a fewer number of problems. Allowing the student to demonstrate understanding orally instead of in writing, again, to avoid the cognitive taxation of using a computer or writing an extensive essay. And providing written instruction for work that is deemed essential. And this is because it can be difficult for the student who has a concussion to process auditory information and to remember it. So when a lot of this is what you need to do instructions are given at the end of a class period, the rest of the class may process that just fine, but it can be really helpful to have that in writing for the student with a concussion, and maybe even providing a follow-up email to that student's parents, letting them know what that student might be working on at home. Providing class notes by the teacher or peer, again, for that same reason, because that auditory processing and retention of auditory information is challenging during concussion recovery. And then allowing the use of a computer, smartphone, or tape recorder to facilitate some of the information that is coming in during class, but also keeping in mind that the extensive use of a computer can cause concussion symptoms to flare. And then finally, allowing the use of notes for test taking because cognitive recall can be quite challenging during the concussion recovery period. If a student's symptom log indicates that they have significant physical symptoms, especially fatigue, these are some good strategies. First, allowing time to visit the school nurse or the school counselor, anyone who has a nice quiet office where they can rest. This is helpful if they have headaches or other physical symptoms. Allowing strategic rest breaks during the day. So that may be on an as needed basis, or they may be more structured. For example, 5 to 10 minutes every 30 to 45 minutes. In a middle school or high school setting, it's helpful to allow the student to pass in the hallway either before or after the crowds have cleared. Not only does that minimize their exposure to light and noise, but it also helps to protect them from a crowded, jostling situation. If a student has light sensitivity, it can be helpful to allow them to wear sunglasses or a brimmed hat indoors. Another way to control for light sensitivity is for teachers to draw blinds or to allow the student to sit away from the window. If the student has noise sensitivity, they can be permitted to study or work in a quiet space, a quiet room, away from visual and noise stimulation. And it's important that there be consideration and discussion around what's going to happen for that student during lunch and recess, and permitting them to spend that time in a quiet space for rest and control for noise sensitivity, but also considering if that is a time that they would be permitted to bring a friend along to eat with or to do a quiet activity with. And then finally, providing a quiet environment for taking tests. Here are some strategies for students who have emotional symptoms that have been identified by the symptom log. You might help develop a plan that allows the student to discreetly leave class as needed for rest breaks. And consider ways to keep the student engaged in extracurricular activities, particularly if they sustained a concussion in their favorite sport and they're no longer allowed to participate. Think about other ways that they can stay connected to their teammates or participate in other kinds of activities. So maybe they can still attend some sports activities but not fully participate in games or in practice. Providing a quiet place to allow for destimulation, helping them explore some alternative activities that are of a non-physical nature. Maybe they would be interested in getting involved in some clubs rather than sports. And then finally, developing an emotional support plan for the student, identifying somebody, particularly an adult at school, they can talk with if they are feeling overwhelmed. Here's a summary of some tools that will be helpful for your concussion team, and they are available as handouts in the appendices of the manual that accompanies this training, as well as links on the website. First of all, in the red box is a flexible set of materials available from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. And it's called Heads Up to Schools, Know Your Concussion ABC. So there are numerous resources, handouts for parents and teachers and athletic personnel that can be very helpful. And they're continually updating those resources. So I encourage the concussion team members to explore and use many of those resources. Next, as far as assessment of concussion, the CDC also has a fantastic concussion signs and symptoms checklist, and we encourage school teams to make these available in the front office at every school. What this concussion signs and symptoms checklist allows is the evaluation of observed signs and symptoms should a student either sustain a suspected concussion at school or come to school reporting that they had some kind of a potentially concussive event like a fall or an accident. This checklist could be filled out by a school nurse, but it could also be filled out by any other office personnel who would check off the presence of observed signs, physical symptoms, cognitive symptoms, and emotional symptoms upon the point of first meeting with the student, after 15 minutes, after 30 minutes, and then just prior to being picked up by a parent with the intention that they would be headed to the doctor for evaluation. So the school can make a copy of this document, send a copy with the parents, keep a copy for the school records so that the concussion team leader can have that as a piece of the student's file. And this form also has a section that includes the danger signs we discussed earlier in this presentation so that the school team members know that if any of these danger signs are present and the parents aren't easily reachable, this is a student who does need to be seen immediately in the emergency department because there could be a more significant brain injury. The checklist has a section for how the injury was resolved, whether the student was returned to class, sent home, or referred to a healthcare professional, and then whoever completed the form signs off on it so that the receiving physician knows if it was completed by a school nurse, a school secretary, an administrator, or someone else. Another tool is the Return to Academics progression. That was that 5-step process, and that's an important piece for you to pull out of this presentation, for you to click on the link that accompanies it and have at your fingertips the progress monitoring chart, that is the concussion symptom log and the ongoing monitoring of academic adjustments, and then the symptom-specific adjustments that take the form of the academic adjustments checklist following concussion. So again, these are all part of the appendices of the manual that accompanies this presentation, and they're provided as links. So I encourage you to print these things off and have them part of a hard copy resource. If managed appropriately through the strategies we've been discussing, a student's symptoms should resolve in a few weeks. However, there are certainly cases where symptoms will persist for a month or multiple months or longer. And if that's the case, academic accommodations and student support may be provided through a more formalized health plan, a 504 plan, or in very rare cases, an IEP. There are also, unfortunately, cases where a student may be exaggerating or feigning symptoms in order to escape work, continue receiving academic adjustments, or sometimes to avoid resuming sports. In those cases, the concussion team should meet collaboratively along with the parents to determine next steps. And just a reminder of the importance of ongoing progress monitoring. So these academic and environmental adjustments aren't put in place for an unnecessarily long period of time. You have several tools that will help you with this. That concussion symptom log that allows daily or weekly tracking of symptoms on a 0 to 6 scale. You also have your classroom concussion assessment form where you're checking off which of the adjustments are being put in place based on symptoms. Along with that, you can also have some open-ended discussion with the student for progress monitoring. So the concussion team leader might meet with the student and ask some open-ended questions like, how is Spanish class going? And that can help figure out some individualized issues that may be only present in certain classes but not in others. So there may be some individualization of what kind of adjustments are put in place. Some classes may still need adjustments and others may not. So that kind of interview process of progress monitoring can help with that. And then again, as symptoms improve, gradually increasing the amount of work, the length of time spent on work, and the type or difficulty of work. And again, all of these forms are available in the handbook. After the return to school process, that's when a student athlete would follow return to play guidelines. And I'm just going to briefly summarize what that means. This could be a whole another hour-long presentation, but in summary, good processes for return to play involve obtaining a healthcare professional's clearance for a student to return to athletic play after sustaining a concussion. And this needs to be a professional with expertise in concussion evaluation and care. And if this step is missed, it can increase the student's risk of neuroinflammation, which can become chronic and lead to persistent difficulties. So the student likely would be cleared to return to play by that healthcare professional when he or she is symptom-free, both at rest and with exertion, with no medication, and when they're back to baseline on academics. And there are some neurocognitive tests, like a test called IMPACT, that can help provide some additional evaluative means of tracking student progress back to baseline. Ohio's return to play concussion law went into effect in April of 2013, and it contains three facets of model legislation, which is number one, education of all members of the athletic community, including coaches, referees, parents, student athletes. And the second part is removal from play if a concussion is reasonably suspected. And then finally, that piece of making sure the student athlete is cleared by a licensed healthcare professional for return to play. So the return to academics process that we discussed occurs before this return to play process, but it's modeled very similarly. So in the return to play process, it's recommended that a student athlete proceed through 6 steps to return to play, and each of these steps is a 24-hour step. The student athlete proceeds to the next level if they're asymptomatic at the current level for at least 24 hours. So first they would have no activity, complete physical and cognitive rest, and if they are asymptomatic after 24 hours, then they could engage in light aerobic activity, proceed on to sports-specific activities and trainings and practices. If they're able to do that with no medication and no symptoms for 24 hours, then they can proceed to non-contact drills. The next step is full contact practice and training after receiving medical clearance. And then finally, the sixth step of the return to play process is full gameplay. I know that different people viewing this webinar have different roles and responsibilities within the school, but here's just a summary of some potential next steps. First and foremost, make sure that there's a designated concussion team leader at your school, and maybe that person is you. Encourage the creation of a culture in the school and within the district that encourages reporting of known and suspected concussions, especially in the athletic environments. And sharing information, providing information to all students, parents, and school staff about the effects of concussions, how effective concussion management can be helpful and decrease likelihood of student health or academic problems. And at the bottom of that slide, there's a link to a really fantastic video from Brain 101 that can be shared, especially with student populations. It's about 15-minute long, and it summarizes what a concussion is, what the effects are, in a fun, animated kind of way. So I encourage your school teams to share that video with students and with educators as well. And then finally, making sure that school procedures are aligned with concussion plan management and that all members of the team have a written guide of responsibilities and expectations. And that can come in the form of the handbook. The handbook also contains a sample policy that can be adapted and adopted by school boards should your school district choose to do that. I appreciate your time and your interest in this topic. This was the full training for concussion team members. We're also creating an abbreviated refresher course that team members can view on an annual basis with reminders of some of the core aspects of the Return to Learn and concussion team process. Thank you.